This is Creativity Drill with Dr. Don and Jonathan Rundman.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another early episode of the Creativity Drill podcast. And we're so glad you're listening as we get the ball rolling on this new program. And our guest today for this episode is Clint Schnekloth, who is an author and a very Renaissance type of character. And he's also a internet savvy and social media savvy person. Our conversation with Clint is very cool. We had a great time talking with him. He's a super fascinating person, and we think you are going to enjoy it very much. So stick around, enjoy the interview, and stay tuned for future adventures on Creativity Drill. One thing to know maybe is I've read the book and Dawn has not. And so,
but I will now that he's done.
Right.
I promise.
You're sharing one. That's totally legit. It's not like you have anything else to read from your publishing house,
I have so
right?
much to read. I have so much to read, and I hope you will stop by the free table.
I'll check it out when I'm over there.
Have you done that before?
I don't think so. Okay. I've only been at the Spark House location,
okay.
which I don't know. Is there a free table there too?
Not as good as the one I'm going to show you tomorrow.
Okay.
So.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, as you know, I'm interested in human development, especially the first years of life.
Yes.
Because I personally think they're more interesting than when we become adults, but that's just my thing. Can you tell us a few stories about young Clint? That is, maybe a story when you were 5 or 6 years old, sort of just starting school, and maybe a story when you were a teenager that sort of really established for you this identity that is so continuous with who you are today. And it's okay to take a moment or two to think of what those might be. But take us back to young Clint and teen Clint and tell us a story.
Well, I can still remember, there's one that I always think of, especially in relationship to books. When I was in really early elementary, kindergarten, there was our school was set up where all of the classrooms were a hub around the central space you would always go through. It was the school library, and you had to pass through, or at least down the side hallways of the library everywhere you went in the school. And there were some different sections of the library that you were allowed to check books out from depending on your development, reading level. And I got the opportunity a little earlier than some other people to go over to the chapter books. And I have this memory, and I don't know how much of this is a constructed memory. You never know when it's a 6-year-old memory, how much of this is people have told me this now after the fact, or I've told it to myself enough times that I can remember it. But I remember checking out this chapter book, and it was about Abraham Lincoln. And I brought it home, and I was super proud that I was getting not just a picture book, but actually a chapter book with no or very few pictures, maybe little pictures at the front of each chapter or something, and read it. And I always think of that story as being kind of the launching point for my life as a reader. Mm-hmm. And I've ever since then have always thought of myself as a reader, a core part of my identity as I read. And so that's one of those ones that I either tell myself or that I think back to. And that was this whole launching point into, there were all these, I especially remember the series that you could pick out either from the public library or from the elementary school. So I worked on my way all the way through the Hardy Boys novels and Boxcar Children, and basically every series I could get my hands on. Earthsea, and I read the obviously Lord of the Rings and Narnia and all those kinds of things pretty early in that process also, and just that opening world that you kind of discovered as you kept. It's wow, somebody wrote 40 books about the Hardy Boys or whatever, and
Did you have partners in voraciousness who were friends of yours in your class, or was that sort of a singular thing that you really? That was
that was a singular thing. I've rarely, and that's still true now. Obviously, I know a lot more readers, but I don't know very many people who read quite as much as I do.
Are you a fast reader? Can you say, quantitatively, you read more words per minute?
I don't know.
I think you must be, because I always see on Facebook you're posting photos of your stack of current books to be working on or to be reading, and it's a pretty constant stream. I mean, you must be going through dozens and dozens of books at any given time.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Or like I just read a whole book on the flight here, Douglas John Hall's book on waiting for the gospel.
At first, I thought you meant that someone wrote a book about your way here. So you just read a book.
I read
Okay.
Douglas John. So like, yeah. But I think it's also that I'm really careful. Like I curate how I have it along with me all of the time. So I have that's one thing that I have available. And if I have the free moments, then that's how I use those free moments. Whereas maybe other people use that time to, do whatever that they do. They knit or they watch television or they do.
So when you read, you don't need to sit down and have a 2-hour block of time. You can knock off like 10-minute, 15-minute blocks and just jump right back into it.
Yeah. And kind of that devotion to that is just something that's always been so I really think of that as like it's my go-to place for how I'm going to be formed. I mean, if I want to learn something new, if I want to change something about myself, anything like that, one of the first things that I'll do.
What do you want to change about yourself?
Like you want to grow or develop or something in some new way. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah. You asked about
teen
teen Clint. Wow. I hate to tell stories about teen Clint.
Oh, there've got to be some good ones though.
Yeah.
What kind of books are you reading as a farm-living Iowan?
Oh my gosh! So I went through a whole period, basically actually until I got to college, from middle elementary all the way to college. All I read was fantasy and science fiction when I had time. Obviously some of the reading I had to do because we were assigned to read, like, William Faulkner or something in high school. But in my free time, I read pulp fantasy and science fiction exclusively. And there was a Walden Books in the mall. This was before the proliferation of Barnes and Nobles and Borders and all that kind of thing, right? And so there was a Walden Books in the mall, which was the only bookstore. I think that was the only new bookstore in the Quad Cities, which now that I think back about that is just kind of crazy because the Quad Cities is like, like Davenport was 100,000 people. But I don't think there was a bookstore other than Walden Books.
Was it Southtown?
North Park Mall.
Oh, North Park Mall.
Park.
Oh, Dawn and I have been there many times.
Yeah. So I would go there all the time and look through the so like all of the Dragonlance novels, of which there are hundreds, and I worked my way through Isaac Asimov and the Star Wars novels, and like really anything that I could read I would, and I would read literally dozens of those per year, and I did that all the time until college. And the only reason I quit in college was because they actually slammed me with enough reading that I was an English major, so I actually had enough reading assigned to me that I couldn't do like extra reading on the side for about 4 years.
I'm wondering if you, as a 6th-generation farm Iowa kid, are you on a tractor in the field with a paperback? Are you in a barn?
Yes, I would always take a book out in the tractor, even if I didn't have a lot of time to read it, just in case there was like an off moment, right? Like, if I was running the grain cart behind the combine, then sometimes it would be the case where I would get caught up and they would combine for a while, and then I could have 5 or 10 minutes at the end of a row, and I would probably read then. Or if I was hauling anhydrous ammonia, then you're waiting for the switch of the tank onto the back of the anhydrous drill, So you've got
perfect
some time
to finish a chapter.
Right.
And do you have a Walkman with foam earpiece and an REM cassette or something on the tractor?
I didn't have those in the tractors because we already had some pretty good stereo equipment inside the cabs of the tractors that I was driving.
Awesome.
Well, at least in the truck, I had a tape player.
So
I can't remember whether I think on the tractors I had to listen to the radio, so I listened to a lot of Rush Limbaugh.
Wow.
I was a huge Rush Limbaugh fan when I was in high school.
Yeah. And that's
a whole other story of my conversion away from.
But it's great radio. And
Yeah.
I'm a talk radio fan myself and a podcast fan.
Yeah.
And I wonder, there's something about a personality who's good with a microphone and good with an audience and good with communicating on a mic. I wonder how that's shaping you developmentally for your career as someone who is a public speaker and a communicator on a microphone. I mean, that's how you turned out. I'm not saying you picked it up from Rush Limbaugh, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I think that what we're doing here right now, I probably learned more, or if there was an early influence on how we're talking now, it would have been like 97X, the radio station that was one of the most popular classic rock stations in the Quad Cities when I was growing up. And it was a big enough town that it had a good radio program with full-time DJs, and it was small enough that you actually could meet these guys. Like I remember one time the two guys that were the hosts of 97X came to our high school youth group and talked about what they did. And the one guy, now I'm forgetting his name, but the one host was a committed teetotaler like you are.
Yeah.
And would talk to us about why he doesn't drink, even though he goes to all these concerts, in the Quad Cities where that's what people are doing while they're hearing these bands and whatever. And I can still remember that conversation because it was just kind of like, seriously, this guy with like tattoos and host of a classic radio program doesn't drink. It was interesting.
Wow.
But yeah, so they would do this chatter in the morning, right? Like there was just that when I was driving to school.
Yeah.
It was like
Drive time radio.
Led Zeppelin and Nirvana and then a bunch of talk.
Yep. Yeah, that's cool. Well, what we're having now, we're talking multimedia. We're talking about books, we're talking about radio, we're talking about reading and writing, and this is a segue into what you've just spent however long writing in your book. And as someone who's a committed reader and someone who's just loves words and language and communicating, now all of a sudden you're on the other side of the glass, so to speak, and now you're an author. You have a book, and not long ago you probably got a box in the mail, and you opened it up, and inside the box was a whole bunch of books that you wrote with your name on it. I mean, isn't that,
just two.
How did it happen? How
there
did
were 5 or something? Yeah.
What did that feel like? Where all of a sudden you realized you're on the other side of the microphone or the other side of the glass as a reader who is now an author, and you've got a work that is publicly available. Like, what is that like?
Well, the first thing that's funny about that is I feel like my experience of that is different than past authors, because before I saw a physical copy of my book, multiple people, Bethany Stoley was the first one to do it, and then Beth Lewis, and then a few other people took selfies with copies of my book that they had in hand that I hadn't seen yet and posted them on Twitter.
Oh, because they had access to the published copy.
Yeah, they came in to the warehouse or whatever, and they had access to it before I did. So I saw a simulacrum of what I would experience when it actually arrived on my desk,
right,
with them holding it before I got to actually hold it.
Right. And so I wonder if
Which
Malcolm
was funny.
Gladwell's friends at the publishing company take a picture of themselves with the new Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, I don't know. But
It's sort of like someone's holding your baby that you birthed before you get to hold your own baby.
that was a little slightly like that. Yeah, that's right. And so I'm not at all saying that then it was a letdown when they showed up, but it was a different kind of experience when they showed up, because I already knew they were in the world, and people were holding them, and I had seen this, and so I'd already had these, which were another kind of fun experience to be able to retweet, Bethany or Beth,
the book selfies
and share those around. Also, just the whole lead up to publishing the book was different because a lot of people share life with me through social media. And so then there had been people who had been kind of following the whole development process, because along the way, I had been posting, updates, kind of like what you're doing with your album.
Yeah, crowdfunding.
Yeah.
Updates for the pledgers.
Right. So you'll do like, video footage of what you're up to, or give us updates about how the album's coming along. And I kept giving updates about how the book was coming along. And so it was more like a process than a final thing. And then when it did arrive, of course, yeah, you hold it and you wonder whether you picked the right shirt to wear for the dust jacket photo.
I think didn't you ask your social media friends even some opinions about your author photo? I recall.
Yes, and people have mixed reactions. Some people really liked. We ended up down to two, one with a smile and one without. And given that the book was Tron-like on the cover, I decided to go with the serious face.
I think that's a good call. I will tell you that I was talking to the cover designer, and he said that you contacted him for some, I think he had it on his desk, and I said, "Oh, I know the author," and he said, "Yeah, he told me he liked the cover." And I said, "Oh, good," and he said, "That's the first author that has ever contacted me to tell me that he liked the cover."
Well, it's a spectacular cover. I just thought it was perfect for the book, and really well, it's eye capturing right away.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I wanted to know, I'm always interested in that kind of stuff with books. My wife does indexing sometimes on the side for books. In fact, she did the index for this one, but I don't think it's the custom of Augsburg Fortress to publish or give credits for the index, as opposed to one time she did an index for the University of Wisconsin Press, and they will give a little thing of indexed by or whatever. These are just different academic conventions that different publishers follow. But so I'm always interested in the overall development of the product, who did these or that pieces. And so yeah, I was of course curious who designed the cover of the book.
And were you able to make the suggestion to credit the index? To credit Amanda with the index?
She did. She didn't feel like she needed to be credited.
Oh, okay, but that's cool to know that she did. It's kind of like a secret for anyone who knows you personally.
Yeah,
to know that that's how it worked.
And
that's
she does get credited for everything.
Yes,
so that's that's inclusive of indexing.
That's right. Yeah, she gets everything.
I thought that was a great dedication. Or
what's your relationship with the physical book itself? When that envelope came with 5 of them in the mail, did you go out to dinner with your family because it was so great, or did you hold the book and look at every single page? I remember the first time I made an album, I was 21, and it was mass produced, and it was off at the factory. And then one day I got a box of them. I was actually at a gig, and the box came to the gig, and I was in a hotel. And I remember opening the box and seeing hundreds and hundreds of my album. It was on cassette, wrapped in shrink wrap. And it was so beautiful, and I remember just be shaking and being in awe. And I remember just holding it for an hour before I took the shrink wrap off, and then taking the cassette out of the jewel box and opening the little tray card and reading it, and I just couldn't believe it was happening to me.
I think when I first got it, the actual print copy, I looked at the parts that I hadn't really seen in any of the pre-production process. I was just curious about how the back cover looked, and some of the layout stuff, how the beginning of each chapter looked, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. But I can't say that I just sat down and spent a whole bunch of time rereading the whole thing, because I feel like I'd already really seen that a lot.
Yeah.
It's a text that I've worked and poured over enough times, so it was more about the feel, the
physicality of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I was really proud of. I feel like the way that Fortress Press printed it. I like it has a good feel to it. The cover, I like matte.
Yeah, it's a nice texture.
Yeah. And if you're gonna go with if you're gonna go with a soft cover printing, the kind of paper that they ran it on, the size and all that kind of stuff is great. It doesn't deserve to be in a hardback. I got to be Walter Brueggemann or something before you can start deciding to sell it in hardcover.
So we're talking about the physical, manifestation of this book and your ideas here, but let's this might be a good way to start talking about some of the thoughts inside the book. And early on in the book, and an overarching theme that I'm reading as a reader, is this idea that I hadn't really considered before, in that, and I'll try to say it from a reader's perspective, and maybe you can straighten out my language if you can clarify a little bit. But the idea that all of life in many ways is mediated. And it's so easy for me as a media user and a media lover to think about the obvious ways media is used. Like we might say the news media or social media, or if you're talking to someone who is an artist, you say, are you using oil paints or film? Or if someone does a multimedia presentation, they might have video and background music and print media. You know what I mean? So that's kind of what I think the regular person's brain goes to when you talk about media. But I think what you're suggesting here is that any extension of humanity is media. And that could encompass, obviously, our language, but maybe even our clothing, maybe the house we live in, maybe the car we drive. And am I on the right track here?
Well, yeah. So the dominant thinker who talks about media as being extensions of the human is Marshall McLuhan. He talks about all of these kinds of mediating technologies are extensions of humanity, and he talks about that both directions. Like they help us extend out further and further into the world. Like a simple example would be language itself. Like without language, we wouldn't be able to do what we're doing right now between us, and it allows like the connection. And then we've got this equipment sitting here, which allows like the further extension of ourselves through this media, or whatever that is. And there's still extensions of yourself. So like say whenever you do finally post this, and if anybody listens to it, then they're going to feel like they've encountered Clint and Jonathan and Don to a certain degree, right? And so this is the way. But then the other way McLuhan talks about it, which is fascinating, is that as that's going on, as you're extending yourself, it actually becomes a part of you, so that you can't really think of yourself as human without those things also. So like a lot of people kind of feel like you might not be fully human if you can't use language in some form, or at least you kind of doubt whether someone's human and then same with a lot of other media. Like you start to just feel like in order to be who you are, you need your phone, or whatever those mediating technologies so they really literally become extensions of yourself. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is draw our awareness to the fact that really actually everything is mediated. And if you like, you could try a thought experiment. Like if you stripped everything away, is there some kind of pure relationality, pure whatever that you could do that's somehow unmediated through different kinds of technologies, whether it's language or writing or all the different kinds of more like say advanced medias that we normally mean when we say media, like television or whatever. And the answer is, try see how that goes.
Yeah.
Right down to your clothes.
Yeah. Well, here's what I thought as someone in the creative world, in terms of like making art or writing music in my case or whatever. I find that people who make art or use artistic media, I think those kinds of media elements get elevated as beautiful or good, right? So if you're a painter, your paintings are wonderful, or if you're a playwright, your play is beautiful. And so the media that you're extending is held up as something good, or something worth working on, or worth striving for, or worth expressing. And what struck me about this idea of everything being mediated is, for me, that elevates everything. And all of a sudden, to me, I found myself thinking, well, if this is true, if everything's mediated, then maybe my clothes that I choose to put on in the morning and the choices I'm making regarding them, are as beautiful as the songs I'm trying to write. or the car that I'm driving, or the way I paint my living room, or just the way I'm extending out into reality is
Right,
itself beautiful.
And of course, any fashion designer is going to agree with you. Yeah, I mean, that's why they care about clothes, right? It's 'cause
Yeah.
they are extensions of who you are into the world. In some ways, they're the first thing that communicates even before language. Clothes are totally under attended to and
Underrated, maybe.
Yeah, maybe, except for the people who really care about them, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's other kinds of technologies that mediate us also, which different kinds of media ecologists will attend to. One of the ones that I pay attention to in my book that I'm really interested in is what's sometimes called procedural rhetoric, which is that by the systems or the procedures you set in place, they communicate certain kinds of things. A great example of this was, so about a month and a half ago, actually, Bethany Stoley and I went over to Valparaiso University to hang out with John Nunes and some other folks for his symposium he was pulling together, and got off the plane, went to the rental car place to rent the car, and we show up at this just plain Jane Enterprise rent-a-car outside of the Chicago airport, and they had it down. You walked in the door, and there was a you know how they have those ropes so that you line up appropriately before you get to the desk. And before we got to the ropes, before there was any confusion about how we were supposed to go through the space, they had a worker stationed at the door that opened up automatically. And she said, "Welcome to Enterprise. We're really glad that you're here. Would you like a bottle of water?" And then pointed us to where we should go get in line. Now that doesn't sound like earth-shattering, except for think about all the other times you've walked into stores where you've been confused, you don't know what the process is, you don't know which line you're supposed to get in, you feel like you might cut if you do the wrong thing, all these kinds of questions. And she solved all those kinds of questions and made us feel at home by offering us water. And I walked out of that, and then everything else that they did, up to the counter, out to the car, getting everything into our hand, and out the drive with the car was perfect. And I'm I'm always going to rent a car from Enterprise.
Yeah.
That. So that's procedural rhetoric. You can handle the rental of a car differently depending on how you design it. And I think that actually, because Bethany specializes in design theory,
and just how experiences are designed, and how
right.
that what you're describing, you can bet that's all outlined in their 3-ring binder training program.
Right. And somebody has designed that for Enterprise, and that place decided to follow it to a T. Now, I've rented cars from other Enterprise places, and not every place follows those procedures as rigorously. Well, okay, so I have a whole chapter in my book that's about the catechumenate, which is a process of faith formation for adults in the church, where I analyze it from a procedural rhetorical perspective and say, well, the constitutive components of the catechumenate aren't that unique in the church. It's stuff like Bible study and eating meals together and worship. If you just separate it out into these different things, well, most churches have Bible study and worship and meals, but it's the way all of it's woven together into a whole, and the way that you walk people through that process, that's what's beautiful about the catechumenate. And it's not a formula, it's kind of an art, but you take all these, and that's really close to clothing. It's amazing how some people can put on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and it looks amazing, and somebody else looks like, wow, they really shouldn't have done that.
Right. And so that's a way of mediation to the procedural rhetoric, and that in and of itself is a media. It's a media, and it's an extension of humanity, and it can be done in a creative way, a beautiful way, an inspired way, and it's function and form.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's both. These are funny words, like another word that is close to media And so probably some other kinds of like cultural analysts would talk about it in these ways, right? So rather than using the word media, like say Martin Heidegger is going to talk about technology, right? And again, when he's saying technology, we tend to think technology means like electronic technology, because that's what we're paying attention to, is whatever the new technology is. But really the term technology is much more wider in scope than that and applies to all kinds of tools, right? Like a lever is a technology, or all that. Yeah, right. A pen. Dawn just held up a pen. We're on the radio, so none of you saw how well she held that pen up. So technology is like media, one of those words that we think we know what it means until we start to like pay attention to the word, and then it keeps expanding.
And one of the things your book says, if I can sum it up correctly, is that we so often think about technology as a tool, but the book seems to be suggesting that technology itself is a way of being, or is being itself more than a tool in order to be. Is that something I'm picking up?
Yeah, this gets, I don't even feel like I would do justice to this, but yeah, like Heidegger talks about technology as a way of being in the world, or yeah, I think those are all, or like a great Christian example from Christian faith would be that Christ himself in his person mediated the presence of God in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's another way of using that term, which gets at kind of the more like kind of ontological categories, that Christ as human mediated the presence of God. And again, and this is with the theological, the kind of the motor that drives some of what I'm talking about here in terms of media. So we also say as Christians that you can't separate God's or Christ's humanity from Christ's divinity, right? Like those are two like woven together things. So you can't have Christ the mediator as a medium and separate it from Christ as the divine, as part of God. And I would say that then applies ipso facto to like our life also. I just don't think you can tease how we're mediated out from who we are. They're just all kind of like woven together into the same thing.
Yeah, and to me that I keep hearing media becoming elevated there. Right. It really it becomes more, the gravity is cranked up for me when I think of it that way. Yeah. Because it starts to get really core and really pivotal and foundational to being itself.
Right.
And in a way that's kind of amazing.
I totally agree. And like and a real simple example that I end up with in conversation with people if I'm going around and like say talking about this book is, some people want to say, they want to make a distinction between virtual mediation and what they'll want to call real mediation. So like they'll feel like and argue that you and I can't really know each other as well if we only had met through what they would label virtual mediating realities, like
Facebook,
social media, or sending letters to each other or whatever. And I'm not convinced that's true. First, but just based on experience, there are some people I've gotten to know so well before I ever met them that when we actually met person to person, it was great to meet them person to person, but they were the person I thought that they were, as far as I can tell, through the digital mediation that had taken place. And there wasn't something like lost because we hadn't met face to face.
It's like you knew them for real.
Yeah, and then there are also people who I've met face to face who I thought I knew, and then you find out that they weren't quite who you thought that they were. And so the real mediation that you had between you actually was obfuscating in some way of who they were deeper down or whatever. So the distinction we make between virtual mediation and then real is, I think, sometimes it's a problem.
we're talking about how we represent ourselves with media, and like you're talking about Second Life and avatars and things like that. One of the things in your book that I thought was super interesting was this phrase that maybe these days something new is happening where the virtual thing or the image of the thing all of a sudden is valued more than the thing. Do you remember where I am in the book when I'm talking about this? And so like the for example, the copy of the thing is more highly valued than the actual object, or the photograph of the thing is more highly valued than the object that was photographed.
I wonder if maybe, are you thinking about the little section I have at the beginning?
Yeah, it's
about
the early on.
Susan Sontag's analysis of photography.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Susan Sontag was interesting because she's got some criticism of photography even while she was fascinated by it, which I think that's always a healthy way to go. I'm in general, like, in favor of figuring out how to do new forms of mediation, but I think it's worth attending to the people who have a critical view. So Sontag had some worries about how, because there are photographs, we simply look at the world differently, and we look at it differently permanently, like there's no going back. And what does that change about how we think about experiences and those kinds of things? And I think there is some truth to that. I was talking with some friends the other day about how before Facebook, I never thought about all of my experiences in terms of how I would frame them to post them as a status update. But now, rumbling in the background of everything I do is, how would I tweet this, or how would I, summarize this for us? Is this status update worthy?
Yeah.
Or, I'll be talking with my kids and I'll be like, is that a quote worth sharing with other people? It's like, now everything is reframed in terms of, is it shareable?
Is this a moment worth photographing and Instagramming?
Yeah, right. And there's obviously some pluses to that. Otherwise, we wouldn't all be doing it. It's fun to share each other's lives and to know some of what people are doing and what's going on in their lives. But if it reframes everything, are there some worries also about what is it a kind of a weird totalitarianism where nothing really exists unless you share it? Or even worse, that you start to feel like you have to share stuff, or it didn't exist, or people might get upset with you if you didn't share. Are you allowed to keep things to yourself?
Yeah.
All these kinds of things are
questions. I've been around people in recent years who are kind of like neo-Luddites or something, where they're experiencing a lot of negative vibes about social media and about the constant drone of how am I going to tweet this, or how am I going to capture this for my online community? And sometimes I'll even read articles on Huffington Post or whatever where people say, I hate Facebook because everybody is only posting the pictures where they look good. Or if there's a picture where unflattering photos are deleted, unflattering images are filtered on Instagram so they look more beautiful than reality. People post updates only when we're at the baseball game, or we're on vacation, here's us at the beach, but they're not posting, here's my messy living room, or here's the fight I'm having with my kid, or here's the crappy weather and it's miserable and it's cold and gross. You know what I mean? So people are choosing to edit their lives to showcase the good stuff of their life. And so I think there are people out there who get a icky vibe about social media in general because they feel like people are editing reality to look better than it actually is. And I think that's what I was thinking of too when I read this idea of how the image of the thing is valued higher than the thing itself.
Yeah. Well, now I would say people have always curated their avatar even before digital social media. So we did the same thing when we went to people's houses. You go to somebody's house for supper and you maybe tell them about the fun trip you went on with your spouse, but you don't tell them about the stupid fight you got in the day before, So that's not, I don't think that's necessarily new.
Right. Well, what I was thinking of is, if indeed all parts of life are mediated, then yes, we've been putting our best foot forward in our media forever. Like, that's why we brush our teeth in the morning and use mouthwash instead of not doing so. Because in that way, we're putting forth sort of a falsified, better version of our natural selves, because we know we're going to meet other people on the sidewalk and have to greet them. Mm-hmm. Or that's maybe why we comb our hair, or wear clean clothes that's why we go to do our laundry, or iron our shirt. And isn't that the same thing?
Yeah, it's a different kind of mediation. What I think is new, if I were to name anything that's new, it's more around how widely we think an experience can be or should be shared. And like what we're sitting here doing right now is a great example of that. Like 5 years ago, you would have picked me up from I don't know, 5 years. Yeah, 5 years ago, you would have picked me up from the airport. We would have come here and we would have like hung out and talked like we're doing right now in some form, right? But we would have left radio to the professional radio people, and we would have listened to people who do that for a living. And now it occurs to us that we can actually take like a living room experience and share it with other people, and that the other people might actually find value in that. And so if anybody, again, when people listen to this, they're going to, in a way, get to peek in on the living room conversation of us, which is that I think that's new and interesting. And the real positives of it, to me, there's a lot more positives than negative. There's a few negatives, but the big positive is we get to share in each other's lives in some pretty cool ways. Like, I know more about the daily lives of my parishioners because of Facebook than I did when I was on internship back in the late 90s and there wasn't Facebook. I get to know quite a bit more about what's going on in people's lives, prayer concerns, experiences, all that kind of thing. And conversely, more of my parish knows about my daily life as a pastor than I did know about my own pastor when I was growing up. Pretty much I just had this image of he preached on Sunday morning, and then after that, maybe he showed up at like our youth group thing on Wednesday night, and that was about all I knew about the pastor. And it's kind of cool because you can live as a pastor in a way that like represents your faith or your tradition or whatever out loud and among people in ways you couldn't do before. And I think that's all like pretty neat. The Luddites would say, and there is a part of me that worries about this, is what does it say about us that we can't simply just have this conversation without the microphones between us? Why can't we just sit down and talk?
I think there are people who'd be really mad watching us do this. Like, how sick are you that you can't even like pick up your friend Clint at the airport and like go out for dinner and just talk like humans? Now there has to be microphones involved? Like, what is that ever messed up?
Yes, that's the interesting piece. And I don't know what I think. One of the things I also talk about in the book pretty often is I think we are still at this point, because so many things have changed and are new, that we're only observing the effects of the transition to new media, and we don't really actually know what the long-term effect is going to be. And like this would be one example of that. Like I'm still, I guess, agnostic on whether that's a good or a bad shift. I can note a few things about the shift that I think are positive and maybe some things that are negative, but I don't think long term that we know. Another example would be, man, okay, you never get to watch a sea of people at work more than at the airport. Right, like and so last weekend I was in the Chicago airport, and then just tonight I was in the Minneapolis airport, and about a about a quarter of the people in that space milling around aren't present. People are like shuffling down the hallway, like on their, like people are like, on their phones or they're on laptops or whatever. So they're not mentally that present. The most present people are the guys that are shining shoes, like the old school technologies. They're like totally there. There was this guy at the Tulsa airport who's like chatting with people and singing. And I don't think he had any devices on him. I think he was just there in the moment, shining shoes. And that's going away. And the new thing that's here, whether we like it or not, is people are like multi-layered. Mm-hmm. And I don't know on term what that's going to mean, but that's a major change.
Right. And well, go ahead.
And I think part of that is where we're choosing, whether that's deliberately or not, where we focus our attention. Uh-huh. Because as humans, we really, we can't pay attention to 6 things at once. Like we sort of joke about multitasking or things like that, but we can pay attention to something for 3 or 4 seconds before we switch over to something else. But as far as how we can slice up our attention span and the neurons that are firing on that, for that functionality, mm-hmm. We just make such different choices. And again, sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's not, about what we're focusing our attention on. And so you can go, and that shoeshine man might be the person who pays closest attention to you the whole day, more so than your kids did when you were leaving in the morning, more so than your spouse did when you sort of rushed, okay, I'll see you when you get back in 2 days, kiss, out the door you go to the cab, more than the cab driver, more than anyone who was at work with you the week before. Like you're actually getting a shoeshine guy, like looking in the eye, having a conversation, at least looking like he actually cares about how you're responding to the question that he's asking. And to me, that's really interesting to think about, especially with kids and kids who are growing up in this. And how do we, as people who are parents who are sort of going through the transition as adults, look at our kids who this will be all they've ever known. And there's so much that they can focus their attention on. And, are there kids now who are going to grow into a shoeshine man, or, is that just going to be robots from now on? Mm-hmm. But, I don't know. I think so much of that is tied up with how we're choosing now to focus our attention, which is a limited resource. Yeah.
Yeah, they're running those streams underneath. If you watch an old school medium like television now, the news is always streaming what people are tweeting about it underneath. So you can both listen to the fact that Donald Sterling got banned from the NBA forever, and then you can read these little comments from the players, which again, you couldn't do that before. So that's kind of interesting. You never got to hear from the players, a decade ago. That's probably a good thing. However, the worry is, how do you weigh those things? Like, how do you weigh the reporting of the reporters versus the opinions, and then like who's curating which tweets get posted, and those are just new questions, I think.
One of the things I'm aware of as I watch media commentary and read stuff online is that there seems to be, it's easy to go to extremes when we're talking about this sort of stuff. Like some people are really excited about technology and media and really like all about advancement. And then there's this Luddite crowd that we've been talking about who are really afraid, really worried, really want to dial it back. And they're going to use words like you said, like present. These people are not present. They want us to be more present, more in the moment, less multitasking and more present and all that. And one of the criticisms about your book, not a negative one, but a comment about your book that might even be in the front cover, is how your book is neither utopian or dystopian. Uh-huh. And I totally found that refreshing. You really don't go running to either of those extremes in this book. And in fact, the overarching undercurrent of your book is overall pretty positive. And even you said it a few minutes ago, like you say, you see more good about this stuff than bad.
Yeah.
So tell me about like why do you have a positive middle of the road zing about you when you write about this?
Well, I think it's because just because something's new doesn't make it bad or good necessarily. That's the kind of the fundamental error, you know. So like, I started reading David Rhodes' novel Rock Island Line when I was on the flight here today, and he, at the beginning of the book, he's describing what it was like to be in these Iowa farmhouses in the early part of the 20th century in the winter. And people were in these houses kind of holed in for, you know, the late winter months with no access to anything. And his descriptions of that are really kind of terrible and terrifying. I mean, people were literally stuck inside four walls with their families with no outside communication, no access. So you could get into terrible fights. You know, people would hear screams and shouts and stuff across the snow of the farms between one farm and the next because people were just so despondent and, you know, whatever. And that is not a, you know, like this wonderful, beautiful thing back then that we've all lost because we've gone to the availability of media. Now, you know, for better or for worse, you can escape to your television or your Facebook or whatever if the going gets rough with your family and the direct kind of face-to-face. So I think a lot of it is that I'm not willing to do the nostalgia thing because I don't think the past was just the past. It wasn't necessarily this like great, beautiful thing that we've all lost. And it's more about how we curate the present and what we have. So we have to approach whatever our current situation is and like aim towards the things that we, you know, really hope for or value given those things that are available to us. And I do think that means there's some stuff that we won't do. You know, like prescription wise for myself, one of the things that I've been trying to prescribe for myself, for example, is because of new media, because of the layering of media, I'm not meditating enough. I'm not finding enough space for real quiet, like honest to goodness quiet that's completely disengaged. Because I'm tempted to, like, even while I'm brushing my teeth, to check and see what, you know, the status updates were that morning, right? Because it's right there. The phone was in the back pocket of my jeans when I got up in the morning, and so I'll just check a couple emails right away instead of having that like moment of. So I think that's like an example of something that it's probably more beautiful to have some silence in your life, and so you got to figure that out. But on the other hand, there's incredible beauty in some of the connectivity that we have and the layering of media that we have, and so it's not like a horrible demon confronting us either.
Yeah, I really love that about your book and about your whole approach, is that it's not doom and gloomy about the future, but it's also realistic. And I just felt like it's balanced and not crushingly panicked in either direction. Focusing more too on something positive and something sort of healthy or life-giving that I found in your book was this idea that I'd never thought of before as media being driven by whim. I just thought that was an incredible word. And I think in the book it's talking about reading, like the motivation for reading being to do it for whim, W-H-I-M, and not for some, you know, not just for information or not just for learning or not just for, and what does it mean when we encounter media and our motivation for doing so is for whimsy or for whim? Like, dig around in that for us a little bit.
Yeah,
that's a great word.
Well, it comes from Alan Jacobs. The art. I forget the title of the book, but he wrote The Pleasure of Reading, right? And he's writing this book. He's a literary scholar at Wheaton, and Jacobs is great. Like, I just love to read him because he has great prose, and he's got this theory that one of the things that has crushed reading of fiction among many adults is that young people, when they're in the formative reading stages, get assigned stuff to read that's like not what they would want to read. So then reading the overt curriculum is you're supposed to have read, James Joyce or Ernest Hemingway or something by the time you're such and such old, because that's part of what it means to have been educated. But the implicit curriculum, or like the null curriculum, is reading is dull and boring and something that other people tell me to do. And so then what the people learn in that formative stage is they learn that as soon as possible, I'm going to avoid doing that because I was burdened with it at this stage that was like wrong for me. And so Jacobs has this philosophy that as much as possible, people should read at whim. And so he kind of goes into this long explanation of what he means by that, but it's essentially that you should read what is appealing to you or attractive, that you're going to find joy or get pleasure from. And then if you want to challenge yourself after you've been reading stuff like that for a while, you should try to swim upstream. So like if you really love Harry Potter, and you just really love the Harry Potter novels, you should just read a lot of Harry Potter and enjoy that. But if you ever get kind of curious about, where that kind of thing came from, then figure out what will be upstream from that. What's like kind of magical realism or other kinds of fiction that come before it, or those kinds of things. And the deeper piece there is we should aim for, like, we shouldn't do what it's essentially kind of this thing of like, don't do what you think people want you to do or that you think the world needs you to do. Do what's life-giving, because what the world needs is more people doing what's life-giving to them, I think.
Yeah. Well,
right?
I thought that whole idea was so refreshing, and I know what it's like to be motivated by that in my own media consumption, whether it's musical, like listening for the sheer joy of hearing a great song, or putting on a really good album in the car and driving down the highway and turning up the music. And it's, there's nothing quite like that. And that can happen in lots of media environments or media channels.
Yeah.
And it's an incredible thing to just ride the wave like that when you find the expression that really connects with you, whatever form of media it is. When you can catch a wave like that, man, there's nothing like that. That's really a wonderful part of living.
Right. Yeah, you can work too hard trying to like something that you're supposed to like and figure out how to enjoy it. And for many kinds of media, it's probably worth just giving up on that and actually listening to what you like.
Yeah.
So music would be an example of that, like
Pitchfork.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're really.
Yeah.
This is what you're supposed to like.
Like, I feel like I'm supposed to like more classical than I actually like. I'm not against, if people like it, great, but I'm more of a jazz and indie rock guy or whatever. And I'm okay with that. I've tried to like rap. I've really tried. And it's kind of rare for me to actually get into it, except for there's some exceptions. And that's what's funny about it is like, so like with rap, I really like MIA or Beastie Boys. So like if I did decide I want to get better at listening to rap and like get into it, then this theory of Jacobs would be swim upstream from the ones that you like. So like with Beastie Boys, you should probably try Public Enemy, or with MIA, I don't know who you would swim upstream from MIA to get to or whatever. But yeah, it's the same kind of thing. Or if you're not really that into classical music, but you actually heard a Vivaldi song that you really like, then swim upstream from Vivaldi and see where that takes you.
This makes me think of something that you said to Dawn and I years ago, because you and I knew each other 20 plus years ago, and then we didn't see each other for a couple decades. And then we reconnected in the mid 2000s. And I remember like right after we reconnected, we were talking about reading books, and I was saying something about like we're reading a book, but it wasn't really working for me, but I felt like, man, I'm going to read this till it's done because I started it. And I remember, and see if you can remember this or if you still agree with yourself, but you said something along the lines of, well, if you're reading a book and you're a couple chapters in or whatever, and it's not working for you, then just give up on it and read something that you really want to read because there's so many books in the world. And I'd never heard anybody give me that advice before. I thought, wow, that's a pretty interesting thing to say. But I thought about it a lot now in my life as I've experienced media. And I don't know. So to me, that's connecting a little bit to Wim. Do you remember saying that?
Well, I bet we were talking about that one. There's a famous librarian from Seattle who does commentary on NPR about books. Like, she suggests books to people. I'm trying to remember her name. I can't. Amanda has the action figure for this librarian because she's
a librarian.
really.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And well, okay, so her rule is the rule of 50. If you start a book, try to make it to page 50, and if it's still not working for you at 50, life's too short to try to keep reading a book if it's still not working after page 50. And then I think she adds that, like, after you're 50 years old, you can subtract 1 page per year because your life is getting short. So if you're like 75, you're really 20. If you're 25 pages in, it's not working, you better just move on to another book. You know, that's kind of her, like,
I think that's
theory.
great. I think it's great advice.
Yeah.
And it sort of gives permission to not feel bad about that.
I think that's right. Except for there's maybe every once in a while there's going to be a book that's like an exception to that rule, like Neil Stephenson's Anathem, which is a 1,000-page novel and it's spectacular. It's one of my favorite novels of all time, and you won't understand what's going on in the book until you've read about 100 pages. So, like, there probably has to be like a disclaimer of like some books are worth.
Yeah. Well, I just
the
read
pain of-
I just read Frankenstein, and I almost never read fiction, but this was like a month ago, and so I read Frankenstein, and man, it's pretty slow across the board, and the first third is really it's not what you would expect it to be, and I think if it wasn't Frankenstein, I would have just moved on. But because it's such an important book, I thought I'm going to power on through. And man, it was so worth it, like, once I got to the end. But, you know, so that one is probably an exception to that rule.
Running off into the icy wastes of the north.
Exactly, right.
That's so funny that you read that, because I just read it over Christmas, and I had never read it.
Yeah, I had never
I don't
read
know how
it.
we ended up reading Frankenstein in the same year. But
Yeah.
We had a book group at our church.
And they read Frankenstein?
Yeah, it was adult forum.
About 20 people.
That's solid, though. That's a good choice.
It was really great.
A lot of interesting questions.
Yeah, we had a great time. Well, this idea of whimsy and sort of joy and freedom in experiencing media, I think this connects to your chapter 4, which I feel extra connected to because this is a chapter that was based on a talk that you wrote for a convention, and I happened to be at that convention, and so I really feel connected to this book because I think it's so cool. I was in the audience listening to you at the microphone deliver this talk, and now the talk is in the book. And I thought that talk was so much fun and so insightful and just a real great thing to dig into with just so much to think about and play with.
Around gaming.
Yeah. And your theory there is the value of the playfulness in gaming, especially what's your anagram? Immersion kind of
massively multiplayer online role-playing games, MMORPGs.
Yeah, and where it's almost like virtual reality kind of gaming, where you're immersed in relationships and in a world or a universe where you're moving through and making your own choices, and the playfulness of those kind of role-playing games that motivates the player, motivates the gamer to in such a exciting way where they're really enjoying it and they're into it, and like you say there, you had the 3 tiers of like, well, there's the first one, and then there's messing around where you start to manipulate your universe, and then by the end you're geeking out.
So disclaimer, this is an academic work, so oftentimes, like, the stuff that you're mentioning these are not necessarily like ideas that are original to me, but I'm engaging like the thought world of other academics in that area. And that chapter especially engages people who are game theorists, right? People who are thinking about like what we can learn about education or other things from games. And that's one of my favorite little things that I learned while preparing that chapter was this idea that you start by that most people, in terms of like hobbies or groups, they start with hanging out, and then after they hang out in area for a while, they start messing around. And they're talking in gaming, they're talking about like the difference between like if you're just hanging out, you're just like trying the game out, figuring out how to like move around in the world. But then you shift after a while to messing around, where you actually will try to change the environment that you're in some way, or try to figure out what some of the tricks are to get through some areas that you hadn't. And then somewhere along the line, some people will shift over into actually geeking out, where they're actually co-creators with the game, or they've signed up for some kind of like volunteer role within a online role-playing game, where they're actually like beta testing areas or things like that, and they've shifted completely. And there's a way of being at each one of those levels. That's also true in normal life. Also, you've got like the people at a baseball game who are just watching the game, and then you got the kids down there who are the water boys, right, who are like retrieving the balls, and you got different levels of engagement with these different kinds of environments. And it really does go back to kind of what seems or feels life-giving. So one of the more interesting things that like say Jane McGonigal talks about is she wonders, why is it that so many people actually would prefer to be playing games rather than living quote unquote real life, right? And so she says, well, that's because reality's broken. We've got reality set up in such a way that people they feel more alive when they're in a game so her thing, and this is the whole transmedia piece, is, so what can we learn from games and bring back into real life so that real life itself is more life-giving and more like the games that people feel good being in.
And what does that kind of playfulness or freedom of exploration, what does that mean, do you think, for creatives who are maybe trying to write music or make a film or paint a picture or write poetry or,
Yeah.
the whimsy part of it?
Well, maybe this, like, I was reading a thing about, I remember reading a review when the new Justin Bieber album came out, and the reviewer was talking about how trapped Justin Bieber probably is, because there's a formula for what he knows he needs to do versus what maybe some of his own personal artistic sensibilities are. And so the album, the reviewer was basically saying, like, the album can only do so much in terms of what he would want to freely do, given what a Justin Bieber album is supposed to do, right, for the studio or for the whole industry that Justin Bieber's a part of. So even though on one level he's gotten what he hoped for in terms of like this massive audience and whatever, he's really super constrained on another level, almost kind of like trapped in the Justin Bieber engine. But then, so compare that to our pastor of New Communities that we called last year. She got signed up and actually hosted David Bazan.
Oh yeah,
in a like a living room concert.
Mr. Pedro the Lion.
Yeah, right. And so David Bazan came to their townhome and did this like living room concert. And what Bazan has done is almost kind of the exact opposite. He's like pared it all down to the absolute as bare bones as he can, right? He walks into people's living rooms with a guitar and nothing else, and plays songs and talks for an hour or hour and a half, and then goes out for drinks with everybody afterwards. And he's really, really free, and you can tell he's having a blast.
Yeah.
Right? Because he's like recording another album, and people were asking him about that, and he's like, yeah, I'm messing around with like, I think it's all gonna be electronic keyboard, this next one, and I've got this sound in my mind that I want to work out. I'm not quite sure I've translated it into what the album is yet, but I'm going there. And you're probably not gonna like it because it doesn't sound like what my other albums sound like, but it's what I want to do. And but so he's like he's like, I don't know how to describe it. he's in a space that he really likes.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's not going to get rich, but he's set these kind of parameters around the art that he's doing that's really helping him get poetic and do what he wants to do. I don't know.
And then on the opposite end, some people get so big and so successful and so trusted that they can pass over the locked machine of Justin Bieber and emerge on the other side, and you get somebody like Neil Young maybe, who now is so beyond that he's now just like Bezan, where he can kind of do whatever he wants and make whatever record he wants and chase whatever weird sort of muse, and his audience is going to let him do it. And even though, and he's the same way, like you might not like it and it's only going to appeal. Or Todd Rundgren, for example, who's one of my current muses, is like Neil Young, where he's been around so long and has such a track record that now he can do anything,
right? And
whatever he wants, and he's chasing that truly. Like he's going to do some really out there stuff that is not mass appeal, but he's not concerned with radio airplay or whatever. He's just doing it for the fun of it. He's like he's the gamer that's geeking out in his universe. Mm-hmm. And that's fun to watch, even if I'm not going to put that record on every single day. It's just to know he's out there doing his thing. To me, watching it, it's exciting to know that, wow, he's really free. He's free. It's fun to just be the witness of an artist who's on that kind of path.
Yeah.
And so when you did your talk, you were talking about the theological ramifications of play and freedom and that kind of stuff. And if our spiritual development or faith development could have that kind of playful gaming atmosphere. So talk about that a little bit, maybe.
Well, I see this in the church kind of often, where people we'll have people, for example, who come back to the church after a long absence, and there was something that kind of awakened in them about faith that had been kind of latent for a while, and when they come back, they bring a kind of life and vitality along with them that's kind of neat to watch. And they're it's just this discovery process of wow, I can do this, I can organize this group of people to serve this meal, or and then there are other people, and I would include myself among this group to a certain degree, who have been in it so long that we've decided you have to play the game by these certain rules, right? And this is how church is done or whatever. And it's harder and harder for us to think outside of that box, because, and this isn't just true in the church, this would be true of the way you build habits in your marriage, or even just how you build your daily habits, right? So one of the lessons I think we can take from transmedia effects for the church or for any of these kinds of contexts is to switch around among them and let them see how they can mutually inform and kind of inspire us to think differently about the mediating forms we normally inhabit, right? And I think that's especially a useful thing to bring into relationship to life in the church. So an example would be, what if we could, what if people approached worship or life in the church the way they approach Minecraft? Where they think of what they think of worship as kind of like this shared sandbox to which everybody can contribute, or those are some of the things I think that gaming can bring to, or insights from gaming can come and bring lessons back to the church.
One sort of theological idea that I really grabbed onto when I heard you speak at the convention, and now that it's in the book, is what's going on with gamers and how free they feel because they have a lowered consequence for failure. And so in the game, if they run out of points and they die, they can revive themselves and start over. Or if they don't like their avatar, they can dress it up in a different way or reform it. Or they can go back to the level where they began and start over. And there's the consequences are either low or nothing at all. So they feel quite free to to keep exploring and keep growing and keep learning and keep relating and all that sort of thing. And like, for example, Justin Bieber, his consequences for failure are really, really high.
Yeah.
So if his next record doesn't debut in the top 10 on the Billboard charts or on the iTunes playlist or whatever, then he's in serious trouble.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't, make the cover of whatever magazine, or if he's not being chased by the paparazzi, then his whole existence is threatened.
Yeah.
But if someone like Neil Young or Todd Rundgren or David Bazan, their consequence for failure is really, really low. So even if they make a record that doesn't sell as well as the previous one, or even if they write some songs that are kind of trippy and weird and the audience is really small, that doesn't matter. Because they're still free. They can still go back on tour. They've still got a fan base. And so when the consequences of failure are lowered and the artistic freedom goes up and the general freedom of life goes up, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And when you apply that to interpersonal relationships, if you're knowing that there's an undercurrent of forgiveness going on, or grace.
Well, that's what
Holy cow. All of a sudden, the freedom and joy goes way the heck up.
Wouldn't it be fun? I'm glad you went there with the grace or the forgiveness piece. Imagine, I was having lunch with a friend the other day, and he was talking about how he had said something to somebody at church that he felt bad about, and he was having trouble going back because he was going to have to see this person again. I was like, well, I said this sounds totally like a pastor thing to say, but isn't the church about reconciliation or whatever? And he's like, yeah, I know it's supposed to be about reconciliation, but actually reconciliation happens a lot less often in the church than it's probably supposed to, given that that's what the church is about. And he's right. Like, people hold you to who you are and what you've said, right? Mm-hmm. They don't let you reboot. So, like, imagine if we had a kind of a culture in the church that was like, okay, Jonathan was a complete ass yesterday, but he's respawned today. And so it's like brand new. He gets to start over. All of his experience points are back, and he hasn't lost any of his special equipment. And he's back in the game. And imagine if we could use that language. You could even kind of port that language into the forgiveness stuff or reconciliation stuff, which all sounds really religious, right? And but imagine if we did that with each other. Because people really do have a hard time forgiving each other in the church. If somebody's wronged you, you kind of hold that. And then that's a big reason why maybe people don't, they stop going to a church or they stop being part of a community because they don't know how to do the part of forgiving or starting over.
And I wonder how these theological values or these theological frameworks affect a creative person who might be, if they're dogged by perfectionism, or if they're dogged by what musicians call the sophomore slump. You make one product that's really successful, and then you have to follow it up. How am I going to follow this up?
What's your next book, Clint? What's your next book?
What's my next book?
Right? Exactly. How are you going to follow this up? But in the arts or in the creative world, people get paralyzed by this
Ralph
sort of
Ellison, right? Yeah.
But if they, for someone who's communicating theologically, the good news for people, not only in their relational lives, but maybe in their creative life, is to recognize that the freedom that comes from that failure does not get the last word, or sin boldly kind of thing from a Lutheran angle.
Yeah.
How do you think that? I kept thinking about the sin boldly quote from Luther. Do you think that connects here at all? The freedom to move about the universe without being paranoid.
Well, yeah, that's certainly another like lesson that you, or the one in my book that I love is this the story of this one author tells about how he has decided he's going to try to learn how to play this game. So he starts playing this game and he's getting totally frustrated because he can't solve this one section. And his son walks in the room and he's like angry. And his son's like, "Why are you so upset, Dad?" And he's like, "Well, I'm trying to solve this thing in this game. And it's not working." And the son's like, "Why are you playing alone?" And the dad has this like aha moment. He's like, "Oh, interesting. So one of the lessons my gaming son has to teach me is I've learned that I'm supposed to solve problems alone. And here's my son, the gamer, who never tries to solve problems alone because he's learned through his gaming experience that you can only solve this stuff through, mutual, like, you get your squad or your team together or whatever to go out and you work on it together."
Or you sit with your friend on the couch in the basement in front of the TV and you figure it out.
Yeah.
And it's fun.
Yeah.
Well, this is a nice way to I think wrap up your book. Can you talk a little bit more about what this means regarding community and media and the importance of figuring it out, not being alone? Or like, what does community have to do with this?
Well, this is the thing that I love more than anything else probably about social media is it creates bridges and networks and communities of people that never or couldn't have quite existed in the forms that they do. I have one chapter in there that's just about the ELCA clergy group on Facebook, which is our denomination's acronym, ELCA, and it's very clear from watching that group that the clergy were really looking for peer-to-peer community, and it wasn't being mediated in the places where they were with quite the level that they were looking for. So when Facebook kind of provided that context, it got tons of energy really fast. And so there's, thousands of participants in that group and tons of discussions every day. And what a lot of people report is essentially the same thing, which is it's so nice to know that I'm not alone, that I've got this group of people that I can, either vent with or that I can present some kind of issue to, and they've had some shared experience that they can bring to it or that kind of thing. And I just love that. I love that anytime that I want to, I could go onto that group and I could say, "Hey, everybody workshop this with me." And I've got like this group that I could reliably, I just think that's really kind of neat. And we didn't have that in quite the same way before. I don't know, maybe previous pastors did this in some other way that I don't know about, but there were times before the advent of Facebook where I felt like, wow, being a pastor must be really, really lonely because you don't have peers necessarily. I mean,
and it's a weird job that's hard to explain to someone who has a more normal job.
Yeah. So that's, I think, just really, and then the way that social media works, it allows like secondary connections. It's always kind of amazing the way, because you're connected to someone, it allows you to be connected to somebody else. And there can be these little, like just today I made sure and friended the pastor in Conway, Arkansas, with two of my young adults who are going to be going to the University of Central Arkansas, and I connected them on Facebook. And in a previous era, I would not have been able to steward the connection to church as they moved across the state with that kind of facility. And they're already like got a little chat stream going where the one guy is asking the pastor, a couple questions about what it's like to live in Conway and all that kind of stuff. And you just couldn't do that before. So there's.
Dawn, do you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask, you've talked about a lot of men. You've talked about one female author, and I think the part of what I wonder about, sometimes I jokingly ask Jonathan when I read about all you read and all you do, and I say, is Clint a robot? Because it's you have a really vibrant creative life, obviously, in authoring and in sermoning and pastoring and fathering and husbanding and so I just like, I'm part of me is hoping that part of you'll rub off on me. But I'm wondering with the immersion that you've had in gaming worlds, and I know that this is not just a male thing, and that there are plenty of women engaged, and there's lots of women doing lots of amazing things on social media and that sort of thing. But part of this, I think, goes beyond just being female to being a working parent.
Yeah.
And thinking like, I don't know when I'd have time to even learn about some of this, just because of the demands of daily life. And so part of me thinks I have such a challenge, like keeping in touch with the friends that I know and love and have known for 20 years and et cetera, that like the idea of going to another network to sort of connect with people, even if we did have a lot in common, I think, maybe I'm being too vulnerable here, but like I think it would push me over the cliff. I don't know. I don't know if you if you read about that, think about that, talk about that sort of thing, but like, is there like an interesting gender overlay to all of this, or maybe I'm just projecting, but
Well, I don't know. So
yeah,
when
I
you
know
were
you're not a robot.
When you were saying that, I was thinking of all the women that I read for this book. So Sherry Turkle at MIT is kind of the expert on the impact of robots on people, actually, and she's really interesting. She studies how people interact with robots.
Alone Together, at least.
Yeah, right. And then Jane McGonigal is the one who wrote Reality is Broken.
Yeah, I remember.
Dana Boyd is the one who studies the networked life of teenagers. Susan Sontag wrote a ton about, among other things, wrote a lot about photography. So I think that it is true. People will talk about that gaming specifically is more men.
Is Second Life more men?
Although that's shifting because of some games like Minecraft. Like when I go to the elementary school now, the girls talk about Minecraft as much as the boys do.
Yeah, I've noticed that.
So there is a gender aspect to this, some of the media stuff, but it varies depending on the platform. Like,
it's certainly different than 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
And there's more women on Facebook than men, and there's way more women on Pinterest than men. So it also depends on the platform, and different genders engage these things differently. As far as like you had another thing in there where you're kind of just saying like, how do I weave doing this into the mix of life as a parent and as a pastor? I never really know how to answer that question, because it's all woven together for me, and I just do what I do. Like I do sleep,
and you go running,
and I have a lot. I do other stuff.
What do you think you've let go of, that you just decide, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's not worth my time.
Well, I don't watch any television.
Well, and that's big for lots of people.
Yeah. I did watch, I have been getting Game of Thrones from Netflix as the seasons come out. So I've seen, that's the only, like since Seinfeld and Friends went off the air, I kind of just quit watching television. That's a long time ago when that happened.
That's a lot of time you have gained.
Yeah. Well, and one thing I don't do that I think some people do more of, but I don't really know the levels at which people do this. Like, I think that some people do things like make sweaters or build boats or I don't know what else they do that's like that
A
kind of
handicraft
use.
kind
Yeah,
of thing,
those
are
kinds
you
of things with
referring
their
to?
time, and that's not my. I've never built a boat.
I have not either.
So I don't know what people do with their time. Yeah. So I've never really known how to answer that question because it doesn't feel overly driven or something to me. It's woven into life.
Can I ask one final question and then we'll wrap it up? This is something I've wanted to ask you in the past, but I either forget about it or we're just kind of running past one another in a hallway someplace. But I recall that when I saw you do your presentation on Chapter 4 here, when you spoke at that convention, and then also when I was a guest of yours in Arkansas and I heard you preach, both times you got a little bit weepy at the microphone.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, wow, I don't see that too often, where it's either the pastor or the keynote guy is at the mic and he's getting a little bit misty-eyed and you had to take a breath and get it together. And I thought that was great, and I have no problem with that. And in fact, I thought, wow, this is an illustration. Like, you really care about this stuff. Do you remember that happening, first of all? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
and maybe let's wrap it up with, like, why do you give a crap so much that it moves you like that?
Well, in the particular case of that presentation I was giving at the ELCA Youth Ministry Extravaganza, there's a piece in it that bothers me enough to be emotional, and that is that by and large, adults are, not all adults, but many adults are skeptical and judgmental of youth culture and what youth are engaged in, and often unwilling to go where youth are. And then at the same time pass judgment on youth for not coming to where the adults are. Right? Like, so everybody's all angsty about how Gen Xers aren't coming to church, and my question is, well, are the people in church willing to go to be where this group of people, whatever group of people it is that they're complaining about, they're not in church, are they willing to go and be where those people are? So if you want to go where some Gen Xers are, you should play World of Warcraft. Right? Or that's one cohort. It's not. So that's one thing. It just kind of bothers me that we do that, and we do it a lot. And then it's also true that we have set up systems in our church that push people away, because they're like, we if you're going to be in the church, you have to do this way, and this is the way we do things here. And we don't create, like, there's some ways in which church would be a lot better if it were like Minecraft, where it were like a shared sandbox where people could mess around with what's in the world, versus if you're going to come into our space, you have to make sure and don't move anything around very much and whatever. So those kinds of things just get at me if I think about them. And then the other is just a kind of a speaking process for me. I think I tear up when I preach, kind of often, and it's because if I care about something, then there's potential that I'll tear up. I don't know what that is about me. It's my quasi-Lutheran Pentecostalism at work or something. I don't know what, but and so the only way that I can avoid tearing up in preaching is if I preach what I would be a boring sermon to myself, which I don't want to do. So
you're willing to take that risk. Do your parishioners get uncomfortable, or do they say things to you about that?
Some people have told me that it bothers them a little bit. Other people really like it. It just kind of depends. I've had people tell me that I should try to not do it as much. And I've had other people say that it's really meaningful to see, either like to see a man cry or to see the pastor. I had this one woman come to a funeral here recently, actually, who is the director of activities at a nursing home, and she's Wiccan, and she goes to a lot of funerals because her folks die, and she makes sure to go to their funerals. And she's like, you got to know, I go to a lot of funerals, and I've never seen a pastor cry when he was preaching a funeral sermon. But to her that was meaningful and powerful because she felt like I cared.
Yeah.
Like I had my, and I'm not saying that you have to cry in order to show that you care. There's tons of ways that you can care, but that was remarkable to her. But I don't really actually know the reason why I've never been able to not do it. It's just like probably 3 out of 4 sermons that I preach, I'll tear up.
Wow.
In fact, one of my youth says there's a timer on it. It's at about 11 minutes.
That's awesome. Well, I'm excited to find out who listens to this podcast. And I don't know who they are or where they are, but it could be just about anyone, just about anywhere. And if they wanted to connect with you, read your book, invite you to come to their event, come to their town, how do you want to be engaged by the people who are interested in this topic and interested in what you have to say about it?
Well, people can, I'm on a lot of the different media, so if people want to hit me up at Twitter, it's at Schnekloth, my last name. My longest standing and most read thing on the internet is my blog, which is lutheranconfessions.blogspot.com. And a lot of people follow me there. I do have a personal website too that has like contact information, that kind of thing. So you can catch me at clintschnekloth.com or any number of other ways.
Would you take invitations to travel to speak and to do workshops or things like that?
I do appreciate invitations, and I try to get out for some. So I just have to look ahead of my calendar. I'm not as ambitious as you are on the travel mode because my kids aren't super used to it, but I do get out some.
And how about access to your book? What's the best way for someone to get your book?
Well, if you would like to acquire it directly from the publisher, it's on the publisher's website. You can order directly from Fortress Press, but it's available through pretty much every platform you can think of. So you can get it through your ebook provider, or Amazon has it, Barnes and Noble, everybody's got it. Just search for Mediating Faith. Excellent.
Well, how do you feel? Do you feel like this was fun?
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Anything else you want people to know?
I'm hungry now.
I think we should get some food.
Yeah.
Wait, what would you tell 5-year-old Clint?
What would I tell 5-year-old Clint now?
Yeah, if you could go back in time and talk to your 5-year-old self at that school with the library in the middle.
You won't make a lot of friends by showing off your intelligence.
Wow. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Creativity Drill.